This is a simple treatment of international trade theory based on two very famous theories. The first one is the Ricardian Model, and the second is the Heckscher-Ohlin Model. The Ricardian Model is the one-factor model, one factor of production, that is labor, and the Heckscher-Ohlin Model is an extension of that theory based on two factors of production. The Ricardian Model has two goods, in this case goods X and Y, one factor of production, labor, and we assume two countries. In order to motivate the idea of international trade, two countries, two goods, one factor of production. So both countries employ labor to produce both of the goods, X and Y. One country would have what Ricardo calls a comparative advantage in industry X and would produce and specialize in good X. And the second country would specialize in good Y. And the country that specializes in good X would export some of what it produces to the second country and import from that second country some of the excess of what that country produces, which is good Y. So once the countries recognize their mutual interdependence, a pattern of trade will be established based on relative factor productivities. That's a simple expression of the Ricardian analysis. And what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is to show you the Ricardian model in the context of the production possibilities frontier with one factor of production. So we say assume one factor of production, labor, assume constant input-output ratios. So we would read this ALY as the amount of labor it takes to produce each unit of good Y, or the average input-output ratio. ALX is the amount of labor it takes in industry X to produce each unit of good X. Again, we're assuming a constant productivity, so these are constants. If the labor demanded in the economy is equal to the labor supplied, and labor is demanded in each of sectors X and Y, we can take LX and multiply and divide by X, in the process creating the input-output ratio times the quantity of X produced. Likewise for industry Y, multiply and divide by Y, so we get the input-output ratio in industry Y times the quantity of Y. Here we rewrite the production possibilities frontier in terms of the labor supply, the input-output ratios in both sectors, and when you look at this particular graphical analysis, you can say that the slope of the production possibilities frontier is given by ALX on ALY, which is the labor in industry X relative to the labor used in industry Y. So this is for one country, and Ricardian analysis assumes that the ratios of labor in X to labor in Y in two countries differs, and this is the motivator for why two countries would trade. If the first country, call it country A, uses a smaller amount of labor in industry X compared to the labor in industry Y, then we would say that country A has a comparative advantage in producing output X because it uses less labor than the other country to produce good X relative to what it uses to produce good Y. We can flip that ratio on its head, and that would imply that the second country would use a smaller amount of labor in industry Y relative to each unit of labor in industry X than the first country. That would form what Ricardo calls the pattern of comparative advantage. That generates the law of comparative advantage, which I need for you to know. Ricardian analysis says that a country will produce and export the good in which it has a comparative or relative advantage in production. Quick summary of Ricardo. The simple ideas that we need to convey is how growth is shown, and if we have fixed input-output ratios and we have more resources, then those increases in resources should push the production possibilities frontier to the right. Notice the intercept on the production possibilities frontier. Quantity of labor is in the numerator. ALY and ALX are constants, so if we increase the amount of labor in the economy, that would take the intercept and push it farther outward, and the slope is still the same, so we show a shift in the production possibilities frontier. When there is more labor, the production possibilities frontier shifts outward to the right. That means that we can produce more of good X or more of good Y along that production possibilities frontier. The second important idea to consider is technological improvement and how technological improvement in one sector would cause the production possibilities frontier to move outward as well. But if the technological improvement is in one industry, we can then produce more of the good that that industry will produce. So if industry Y is the one with the technological improvement, then we expect to be able to produce more of good Y. Of course, if you decided you only wanted this original level of good Y, then you can move across horizontally and see that instead of getting none of good X, now you can produce quantity of good X right here. So you could decide that even though you had technological progress in one industry, you really didn't want any more of that industry's output. And you would use the saved labor to produce more of the other good that you wanted to produce and consume. We have two main ideas in the Ricardian analysis: how we show an increase in the quantity of labor and how we show technological improvement, both showing the production possibilities frontier moving to the right, one in a parallel fashion, the other rotating about the point, the pivot point for the industry that did not have any technological improvement. The second main model used in international trade is the two-factor analysis. Instead of just focusing on labor as the only input, we now focus on a second factor of production. In this case, we're going to call it capital. So this model is called the 2 by 2 by 2 model, with the Ricardian model being called the 2 by 2 by 1. And the difference here is the first two, the number of goods, the second two, the number of countries, so 2 goods, 2 countries, and the third number refers to the amount of factors of production. So the 2 by 2 by 1 is the Ricardian model with one factor of production, labor, and the 2 by 2 by 2 model is the Heckscher-Ohlin model, or the factor proportions model. That's another name it has. I'm introducing here a linear program inversion. So if you just had two equations, the first constraint we're going to say is our labor constraint. And when you sketch that the same way we did in the Ricardian analysis, the slope is given right here. And you also sketch the capital constraint. And if you do that, the slope is given right here. Then the intersection of these two in a linear programming model would be the point where all of the labor is being consumed. That's what the frontier on the labor constraint means. And all the capital is being consumed. So at this particular point right here, we'd say that the economy is at full employment. If you were on this lower line segment, which represents the labor constraint, you would say that you're using all of the labor you have, but there's still some capital left over. So this area right here would represent unemployed capital, and this area here would represent unemployed labor. A developing country, very important point, is more likely to be producing on this frontier, or this line segment, using all of the capital it has, and having a surplus of labor. That's Lewis's original idea, and the Harrod-Domar model as well, that many of these countries had a surplus of labor, and if they could get more capital, they would produce more goods. Let me show you very quickly the effect of increasing the amount of capital. Remember, in the equation, so if I were to increase the intercept from right here, I'm shifting the capital constraint outward. You can see that the economy would increase its production possibilities by the area right here. That would be a larger production possibilities set. Notice what happens at the intersection. This is very important. At the intersection, if I can exaggerate it a little, you would see that the intersection would occur somewhere here, and if it does, it would mean that rather than producing this quantity of X, we're now going to produce a lower quantity of X. Rather than producing this quantity of Y on the vertical axis, we're producing a larger quantity of Y. Again, notice that when we have more capital in this economy, we would have more of good Y being produced and less of good X being produced. If you were to think this through, the logic would be that if you get more capital and one of the industries uses a higher amount of capital compared to labor than the second industry, the additional capital will go into that capital intensive industry. We would call our two industries capital intensive and labor intensive. And if we get more capital, it would draw labor out of the labor intensive industry, and that labor will combine with the capital to go into the capital intensive industry. It's a very important depiction there. I hope you get the main point. So here we have our production possibilities frontier. I've left off the extra segment, so the production possibility frontier is two straight line segments, and here we said this would represent our capital constraint. This is representing our labor constraint, so the developing country might be producing at some point here on the red segment of the production possibilities frontier. So our production possibility frontier comprises the appropriate line segments from the labor and capital constraints. There's one unique full employment point. Recall when I introduced the Ricardian model, I took the labor demand and divided the quantities of labor by the quantities of output and created input-output ratios. I'm going to do the same thing at this point with the two-factor model. The two-factor model, if you would look at the first equation, you'd see that's exactly what we had for the Ricardian model. I'm adding a second resource, capital, doing a similar analysis, multiplying and dividing by x, multiplying and dividing by y, and creating input-output ratios. Now I have four of these, ALX, ALY, the original two, AKX, AKY, going with the capital constraint. The logic of what I said earlier can be figured out that if you have more labor, you would produce more of the labor-intensive good. If you get more capital, you will produce more of the capital-intensive good. The logic does not stop there. There's a trade-off, because as you draw labor out of the labor-intensive sector, the output of the labor-intensive sector should contract. So when we bring more capital into the system, it will draw labor out of the labor-intensive industry, causing the first sector to expand. There's one thing I would like to say here, because most textbooks do not use the linear programming version of the production possibilities frontier. What they do is they use a smooth PPF. The smooth PPF looks more like the curve I have in this analysis here, and so here's my two straight line segment short run, I call it short run production frontier, and this would be a long run smooth PPF, the one you would normally see in the textbooks. The key point I want to make here is that often countries are operating in the short run, and I think the linear programming version of the analysis is much more acute in solving the problems and thinking through the problems when there's short run decision making than is the smooth PPF version, which is for the long run. The key point I want to make here is that because there's a unique full employment point when the straight line segment PPF touches the smooth PPF, if there were some way that we could mop up the excess, in this particular case, here's my labor constraint. So here we have underemployed capital. If I can somehow combine that underemployed capital or unemployed capital with the labor, I can squeeze out some more productivity, and you understand this segment of the production possibilities frontier. In a similar vein, if this is my capital constraint and I have unemployed labor, if I can force that labor to come back to work with the capital in some different way, then I should be able to get more output. I reiterate and remind you that the version of the PPF you see in textbooks is that smooth PPF version. I wish more textbooks would use the linear programming version because it conveys the idea, firstly, that there's unemployment or underemployment of resources. The next bit of analysis looks rather complex, and I hate the idea of showing you a final version of a problem. I prefer that you see how it is worked out. But this is called the Edgeworth Box, and Edgeworth will design this analysis first, and therefore that's why it's named after him. In this Edgeworth Box analysis, I'd like to show you the original production possibilities set for country A. I want to tell you there's a second country, country B, which has same input-output ratios, and it has its own production possibilities set and frontier. What Edgeworth wanted to do was to take one of the countries' production possibilities set, rotate it 180 degrees, push the two of them together to create what he calls a production point, and then say that the countries can trade their way back to the levels of consumption that they would desire. Notice that when there is no trade, you have to produce and consume the same thing, and I'm saying here that country B would have preferred and consumed point BC, country A would have preferred and consumed point AC, and now because they're both in the same quadrant, I call this the northwest quadrant of the analysis, you can do further analyses on these two just to show that there would be gains from trade. In other words, if you recognize that each point in the analysis represents a level of good X and a level of good Y, then you could see that a point such as this one right here contains more of good X, there will be an increase in good Y, and we're saying at the ultimate end of this analysis that when two countries that are minding their own business, so to speak, recognize the mutual interdependence, they will change their production patterns, produce full employment, and then trade their way back to the intersection of these two indifference curves, higher level indifference curves. And that would show that country B that started out consuming at this level right here can now consume more. Country A, which started consuming at this level, can now consume more. And that tells us that there are gains from trade. The gains from trade require that the countries move away from their autarky, production equals consumption points, specialize partially at full employment, and then trade their way back to the consumption levels. And that says that trade is good. That is where the Heckscher-Ohlin or the two-factor model leads us. The analysis we just undertook pointed to the fact that both countries would be better off at IC1 indifference curve 1 for both countries because it would represent more of both goods than they had in autarky. This is a very good deal, and therefore we say that two countries would have a basis for trade when they consume in different patterns or when their resources, the ratio of their resources is very different from what they currently have. The country with a large amount of capital per worker is said to be capital abundant. The country with a large amount of labor per unit of capital is called labor abundant. A relatively capital-rich country will export capital-intensive goods. In this analysis, the way we would show exports is by saying the countries are going to move their production from point AC to point PT, say, sell exports, purchase imports, and in the process move from AC to AC1. You can see then that AC1 contains more of good X and more of good Y than does AC. So that would say that there are gains to be had from international trade for both countries. This analysis suggests that trade will occur and benefit both countries A and B if they like different bundles of goods X and Y. If A likes the point AC and B likes the point BC, pre-trade, both can benefit from trade. In an international trade class, the comment I like to alert students to very early is that differences are what drive trade. In the Ricardian model, it is differences in relative factor abilities, and in the Heckscher-Ohlin model, it is relative factor abundancies. So one country has a higher capital per worker ratio than the second country, and the country with a higher capital labor ratio would export capital intensive goods. The country with the additional or larger amount of labor will produce and export labor intensive goods. We've spent some time developing the Heckscher-Ohlin idea, and you can see that both countries would benefit if they're producing at points A, C, and BC in autarky. This is the smooth PPF version of the model. The analysis will continue to be the same. Here's a relative price line after trade. The relative price line, or the ratio of prices before trade, is given by the intersection of the indifference curve and the production possibilities frontier in both cases. And even if these countries never declared what their original prices were, we can assume a barter type economy, which means that trade will occur. The key point here is that when you discover the second country with a difference in relative abilities, you pretty much offer to do for them the things they can't do for themselves, and vice versa, receiving from them the things you don't like or you can't do for yourself. And clearly then both countries should be better off at a point such as the red dot, because it contains more of good X and slightly more of good Y for both countries. How much trade will occur? Well, in the case where the two countries have different relative factor abundances or like different things, you can see that the indifference curves would be in the same quadrant. Sometimes I label the quadrants northwest, southeast, and southwest. So this is the southeast quadrant, and the quadrant at the top is the northwest quadrant. In the southeast quadrant, there's a point such as right here. I don't have a label for it, and that would say that one country would produce at this point, consume at this point, so it'll be exporting that particular good, and the second country would be importing quantities that the first country made available. This is called the trade triangle, and it measures the balance between exports and imports. If you were to zoom in on the trade triangles, this would represent maybe exports. I call this exports, exports, imports, imports. But each country would have an identical trade triangle, and it's given up one thing to acquire more of the second thing. The main idea I wanted to convey, according to Jagdish Bhagwati, is that it's possible that growth can occur in a country, and because the country is a trading nation, that growth can cause the country to become worse off in consumption. Here's how the analysis goes. Suppose this is a labor constraint, and this country A, gets more labor. Its production possibilities frontier, if it uses the labor, would shift outward to the right. In the process, notice the full employment point shifts downward, so country A is going to produce more of good X, but it's also going to produce less of good Y. The key point here is that sometimes you can grow your economy, too much of a good thing, and that increase in quantity can push the price down overnight. And the extent of the prices going down is that the country that was producing at P1, consuming at C1, will find that even though its production increased, the terms of trade moved against the country, export prices, and caused the country to be worse off than it was at CA1. It's now at CA2. So somewhere between the growth and the trade, the country ended up being a loser, losing the advantage that it may have had, whatever small advantage it had. This is called immiserizing growth. Hopefully you will be interested in this concept. Growth that makes you worse off. In a rational world, nobody would do this, suggesting that when immiserizing growth takes place, it is outside of the ability of residents and citizens and scientists to stop it from happening.